history, megaliths, landscape can be used to inform our modern lives, to inform the myths that we create for ourselves, for our society, for reconstituting our identity in the places that we live. Because if we look at the places that we live in, we're all grounded within a history within those places. And if we look at the concept of palimpsests and how landscapes grow and how people grow within them, the landscape exists. The landscape exists before we arrive, before we're born. The landscape existed before our families were born. So we can ask, where does that landscape come from? And that landscape, I believe, comes from a combination of what came before. And what came before is often myth. The seeds of myth are often the beginnings of most societies, because they're the stories that define our identity. They're the stories that define the things that we believe about ourselves, about where we've come from, about who we are, about who our families are. And those myths are embedded within our landscape. Because when you walk, you get up every day and you have your social landscape. You have your physical landscape that you walk through. Every morning on your way to work or to school or even shopping, you walk along the street. As you walk, you take steps with your body. You look at things with your eyes. So we're very physically interacting with our landscape. But what we often don't realise is that we have a mental landscape layered on top of that. We have an emotional landscape layered on top of that. We have a landscape of identity which is constructed in every moment as we walk through our physical landscape. Because what you do is every moment that you're interacting physically with your landscape, you're creating emotions, you're creating thoughts, and you're taking all of this physical information, you're joining it with how you feel about that landscape. The memories that you have about that landscape from when you were a child. You take that further and you think about the memories of the people around you in your family that have told you about that landscape. You have your own stories embedded within that walk to work. You have the stories that your parents and your grandparents have told you about those places. You've layer upon layer of memory. And even before that, we have history, the history that we learnt in schools about our own local landscapes. And we have the stories and myths that we've read about our own local landscapes. So every morning when we walk to work or to the shops, it's like an explosion in our minds. We take a step, and with every step, it's like an explosion of memory and story and imagination. Because each one of us, through our own experience, recreates that moment and that magic of memory, story in our imagination to create a new experience of our own landscape. Now, that's all very well, and people like to take that moment, take that explosion, and turn that into literature, into our own stories, and share that with other people to come together and explore the concept of landscape, of history. The people in more recent years, now I say recent years from an archaeologist's perspective, in the last few 100 years, maybe since the 1400s, or maybe since that short time when writing was introduced. So, in that short time, monuments and landscape and story have all been joined together at this moment, at this place, across the last few 100 years. What I want to do is take you further back. I want to take you back into the time before writing, before people wrote down their stories. And I know many people are quite sceptical. Many people are excited about archaeology, but many people are quite sceptical about archaeology because they say, well, isn't it just a good guess? How do you actually know? Aren't they in themselves just stories that archaeologists are creating? Because they're kind of putting pieces together and it's like, oh, well, wouldn't that be nice? That could have been real. A bit like some of the historical novelists. Yeah, the seeds of truth in there, but how much is true? And I think that's a very interesting question. But I also think it can be a very personal question. How much do you believe is true? What kind of evidence do you need? But I'm here to tell you about the archaeological perspective. Because what many archaeologists believe, and indeed say when confronted with this question of, but how can you know? They will go through the methods of archaeology. And rather than talk about that specifically today, I will give you a very brief overview. What archaeologists, in essence, in modern times anyway, with the post-processualists, that's a whole different debate, are trying to do today is reconstruct a worldview of prehistoric peoples. Now, when I talk about prehistoric peoples, what I'm going to generally refer to today is prehistoric peoples in Britain who are pre-Roman, okay? So it's pre-writing, pre-history, the first written records in Britain, and mostly in Europe. I'm not talking about the classical world, I'm not really talking about the Near East, and I'm certainly not talking about America. Okay, so, nor am I talking about Neanderthals. So what I'm talking about is that period of history before the Romans, but after the Neanderthals, okay? So let's pin that down a little bit more. What we're talking about today is the Neanderthals are over here. We have cave paintings. We have the wonderful paintings at Lascaux in France of the bison charging across the caves, the famous paintings. We have, before that, the famous Venus of Willendorf, the mother goddess figure, who probably isn't the mother goddess, again, another discussion. And then over here, we have the Romans. We have the first invasions of Britain. Now, before this, we have the Celts. Again, questionable. Romano-British. We have the classic Iron Age in Britain, La Tène, with the beautiful artwork and a lot of Irish influence. Before that, we have Hallstatt, which is the stereotypical Celts with the huge swords. Before that, we have the Bronze Age, and you can talk about Wessex and the amazing gold work that is found in the Stonehenge region. And really, that could be spoken about as the centre of the Bronze Age in Britain. We're talking about before that. We're talking about the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. And that comes just after the Mesolithic, which is the Middle Stone Age, when we had tiny microliths and people were still hunter-gatherers transitioning to farming. Before that, we had the hunter-gatherers of the Old Stone Age, with the Neanderthals, the cave paintings, all of that kind of stuff. So let's bring us forward in time again to the Neolithic. Now, the Neolithic in Britain came, the earliest dates really 3,800 BC. And what that is pinpointed by is the first appearance of domesticated cereal pollen in Britain. And really, we're talking about in Ireland, okay? And what that means is that's the first time people actually took the land, took seeds, took food, and messed with it, and planted it in the land, and made the land their own. It's the first time they stopped. They were sedentary. They stopped in the landscape and said, this place is ours. This is the point in the history of man where for the first time people said the land belonged to them. And they took it and they made it their own, and they acted upon it, which is a really important point in landscape studies. And a really important point for all of these stories that we're now creating today, and definitely an important point when we think of our own perceptions of landscape and the stories we imbue in that, because we consider that we own the landscape. Now, while we might not think that, we really do. We own it with our stories. We own it with our own houses, whether we buy, we rent, whether we have huge tracts of land that we say belong to us. We all have that concept of that little place in the world where we have ownership. And that's when that began, back in the Neolithic. Before that, people were hunter-gatherers, and there was a huge transition between sedentism, between hunter-gathering and roaming the landscape, and sedentism when people first began to build houses and farms and things like this. But this is the world that the Calderstones was built in. It was the first time that people came to the land and said, this is mine. So archaeologists come and they say, how do we know about this? How do we know how they felt? How do we know why they did this? How do we know why this was built? And that really is the question that we're coming to. How do we know why this was built? Now, we can make up stories. People have made up stories for centuries. People have looked at the stones and said, bloody hell, they're big, aren't they? You know, I couldn't carry one of them. Who could carry one of them? It must have been a giant. Must have been a giant. Who can pick one of these up? And if I was a little bit more cruel, I'd have some kind of physical demonstration now, but I won't do that. Okay, so imagine, who is doing this? And you and all your mates on a Friday night, are you coming along and building this megalith? You're not. You might think you can when you're drunk. No, that's not happening. No one is coming with their mates to build this megalith. Who could have built this megalith? Giants. Who else? Gods? Giants? Must have been. And we get these amazing stories from all over the Atlantic facade where megaliths are found. And that would be Britain, Ireland, parts of Spain, France, Brittany. We also get them into parts of Scandinavia as well. We get them in Denmark, Norway, So there's this whole movement of who was doing this. The giants must have done it. And these stories are coming. Some of the best examples are from Brittany. And I found a very obscure text written in French from umpteenth century, way back when. And the stories are just beautiful. The stories of fairies. Fairies built the monuments. The giants built the monuments. They were running across the landscape and they had an apron full of stones. A female giant running, and there in her apron was just full of stones. And as she ran, she dropped them one by one across the landscape. That's how they were built. Must be. And there are other stories. Oh, well, no, the local giant, well, he took a rock and he was just having a game one day, just threw them. That's where they landed. And that's where they stayed, in the landscape. Now, archaeologists don't believe that giants did it, because so far we haven't really found evidence of any giants at all, which is quite important, because that's one of the things we use. We use evidence, and we have different categories of evidence that we like to think tell us about why things were done and the way people felt about things, and what might have motivated them when they were going on their walk to work to say, oh, I'm going to build a megalith there, I'm going to do that tomorrow with my mates on a Friday night. So it wasn't the giants, so we think. So we look at evidence, and what we can do is we can look at the Calderstones, and they're quite higgledy-piggledy. That doesn't look like a tomb. That doesn't look like a megalith. So how do you know that what people here and the books are now telling you, how do you know that was a megalith? Well, what we can do is we can look at how the stones were made in other places. Are they the same? And if they're the same, how would they have been put together? How would they have been put together way back when, back in the Neolithic? Well, we can look at some examples. And there are some examples that are so close, and no one's ever heard of them. I hadn't heard of the Calderstones for years, until I actually went and studied the Welsh megaliths. And then I found out, yes, we have one too. Quite similar to the Welsh ones, and to the ones in Brittany, and to the ones in Ireland. Now, what we have in North Wales are amazing megaliths. We have Barclodiad y Gawr, which is a passage tomb. And what that means is that's a huge chamber, and the stones are stacked around the walls of a huge chamber. And then that is covered with earth, and that it is a passageway lined with stones. And there are lots of theories about, is it a womb? Is it about entering the womb and then being reborn into the world as you pass back down the tunnel and into the light? Maybe. Maybe it is. Is it travelling into the depths of the other world as you go into the tomb and into the darkness? Now, that's quite likely, actually. We think maybe that is true. And the one at Barclodiad says that. You walk along a passage and then you come into a chamber, and you have this amazing artwork all around the walls of concentric circles and geometric shapes. And this is similar to the artwork that we have on the Calderstones. So it's very easy to say, well, that artwork is like this artwork. And these stones, the way they're shaped, they're similar to these stones in Barclodiad y Gawr, the way they're shaped. Could they be the same? So what archaeologists do is they look at other tombs and see if they're similar too. There is another tomb in North Wales, just outside of Bangor, as you go over the Menai Bridge, and you go towards the Sea Zoo, and you come to Bryn Celli Ddu. Apologies to any Welsh speakers here, my accent is not amazing. And there again, we have this example of a huge passage, really quite long passage and quite narrow, like a cave when you approach it, and a chamber made of these huge stones with a massive capstone covering it at the top, a huge slab of stone. And you walk into that tomb, and it's like entering the other world. And even there you have a tiny spiral on the wall, like here at the Calderstones. So yes, they're pretty similar. And even further, in the famous Newgrange complex, the Newgrange Cemetery, we have similar tombs, and the Arthur Noth, which is a tomb within the Newgrange complex, is very similar. Now, what we have at Loch Crew is we see one of the tombs there have a light box in the passageway, and what happens is on the equinoxes, so that's in spring and in autumn, the sunlight at the sunrise shines through the light box, which is like a little hole, and the light that comes in shines on the passageway, and it moves along until it hits the backstone. And in a way, this is like a calendar. So in effect, what we can actually do is use this light box to count down to the day of the equinoxes. So this was obviously part of the function of these tombs. So that gives us clues as to what these tombs may have been for. This is the first time when these were built that people owned the land. Now what we see is them counting down the seasons. They're farmers. They need to know the seasons. How do they do that? Now, if you look at other tombs and stone circles, what it tells us is that they observed the movement of the sun for 17 years, because that's the only way they could have come up with these calendars. They had to observe for 17 years to get this process, to get this calendar. Now, that's an amazing amount of work. That's an amazing amount of information to collect over such a long time. Now, it doesn't seem that long to us, but if you think thousands of years ago, when we're talking about tombs, we're talking in terms of millennia of a Neolithic period. Yeah, Neolithic, I know about that. That was thousands of years. The Neolithic ran from 3,800 over in Cashel, Kilty in Ireland to the coming of the Bronze Age, which is 2,600, 2,700 BC. That's a long time. That is a long time. And when you look at 17 years within that, that kind of puts things into perspective. And that group of people saying, yes, we believe this, we're going to sit here and document this for 17 years. That meant that man took hold of the land. Man took hold of the seasons. Man took hold of the power of the sun. And for the first time in human history, made that land his own. And meant that we could farm the land, and we didn't have to roam, we didn't have to follow the herds, we didn't have to struggle through winters where there was no hunting, there were no animals, it was scarce. We didn't have to make our food last in bags strapped to our legs as we walked through ice. For the first time, we built houses. We took the land, we farmed it, and we made it our own. Now, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's something for you to think about. But really, that's what we can see these megaliths as. We can see these megaliths as markers of place. This is a massive task. You're not making this megalith on a Friday night with your mates. This is a huge task. This is a lot of work. This is 17 years of observation before they even got to putting these tombs up. And how we think they made them was quarrying some of the stones out of huge slabs. And then, like the theory of Stonehenge, rolling these stones on planks, on tree trunks, across vast tracts of landscape to sacred places where they believed the sun would do this amazing thing and line up at the winter solstice, for example. Now, they don't all show us that, but the fact that a few do show us that suggests that that might be a big thing, a big reason why they were created. Also, if you think about the amount of time that these things took to create and the amount of manpower, as we've said many times, you are not making these on your own. A few people are not making these on their own. In order to do this takes a lot of time. This takes a lot of know-how and specialist knowledge. By making this, You're saying we're powerful. We have this advanced modern knowledge. No one's done this before. No one's taken the land and cultivated it. No one's taken markers of place and made such an effort to put them in their landscape to show this is ours. We control this landscape. We can make the earth grow our food. We can take the rocks of mountains and drag them to our sacred places, and we can capture the power of the sun and the knowledge of the sun to make our food grow and to keep our families alive, which was a much more vital thing back then. It's obvious to say there were no hospitals, there was no modern medicine, there were no supermarkets. Life was hard. Life was very hard. And you had the power, the manpower, the knowledge and the physical resources to go and move a mountain and bring it here to where you lived and erect that. What does that say to your neighbours? What does that say to the next tribe along? Don't mess with them. Don't mess with them. Have you seen what they've just put up? Now, okay, you've got that aspect. They're quite powerful. They can take time out of their day from making their food to go and do this. How many people are there? How many people are there making these things? How much must they know? My God, I don't want to mess with them, that's for sure. I'm not putting up a megalith by myself, me and my friends. It's not a Folklore Thursday project. Let's just go put up a megalith. No, it's a huge thing. It's not something to enter into lightly. And if I was their neighbour, I was the next tribe along, I'm not messing with them. They're important. They know a lot. They're clever. And they're powerful. They've taken the land and they've made it their own. I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. How do they know to do that? Who came up with this? There's another question. Well, these people, did they just think of this one day? Well, the idea is that people actually brought this knowledge. This originated, this idea of farming, not the idea of megaliths, but the idea of farming originated in the Near East. We find evidence of the first domesticated sheep and goats and cattle over in the Near East, thousands of years before. So it's happening earlier over there. And then over time, the theory is because of land pressures and environmental factors, people were pushed out of their homes in the Near East and they travelled right across Europe during the Neolithic. And they actually followed the lowest soils, the fertile soils, as they snake across Europe. And you can chart this by the appearance of cereal pollens, the appearance of the animal bones, which all look slightly different once they've been domesticated and bred for their meat, for their wool, those kind of things. And you can chart the appearance of pottery, because that was an integral part of farming too. The first pottery vessels were made by these people, which meant a massive thing. For the first time, they could cook their food. They could cook soup. You could cook meat before. You could cook in a stomach. You could boil water in a stomach. Lovely. For the first time, they had pots. And we find that they made things like gruel and that kind of stuff, and we see evidence of that in their teeth as well. For the first time, this lovely gunky gruel was getting into all the cracks in their teeth. They were making bread. They were growing wheat. They were grinding the wheat. And the tiny little stones from the quernstone, little chips, were getting into their bread and wearing down their teeth. And I will say, the health of people at the onset of farming, terrible, terrible. Their teeth were awful. They were rotting with this warm, sticky gruel, chewing at stones. They're not walking miles for their food every day. They're not hunting. They're going out and working the land, which means they can have more children. So the population increased with this farming, the ownership of this land. My children live here in my house. I work the land to support them. I can have more children. Before that, you had to be able to carry your child. If a mother couldn't carry her child with her, she had to leave it behind. That's what modern studies tell us. When we would look at a tribal hunter-gatherer peoples today and in more recent years, if they can't carry that child, they have to leave it behind. Now that's very sad, but the child dies, or the whole tribe dies, or is detrimentally affected by how slow that child is. You can't do that in that landscape. You can't do that. Life is hard. You need food. So for the first time, I can have as many children as I want. I have as many children as I can feed. And I have this land and I've made it mine. And here's my megalith to prove that. So how were they built? We don't know that. How do we know that? It happened all those thousands of years ago. Well, what we can do again is look to more modern peoples, again modern in an archaeological sense. At the turn of the 19th century, people went over to the Medina tribe in Madagascar, because they also have similar kind of megaliths. They're not the same. They don't have the same construction. They don't have the same artwork. But people went over there and they looked at how they were living, because they were hunter-gatherers. They were just starting with farming in the same way we would have been in the Mesolithic to Neolithic transition in Britain when the Calderstones was built, when all of these other tombs were built around here, around this part of Europe. And that's what they're doing in Madagascar not so long ago. So people went over and they watched them build these and they asked them why, and they asked them for the stories about the megalith, and they got them. They got them. Now, they're not the same stories. We cannot say, yes, they are the same stories that our ancestors in Britain used all those thousands of years ago. But they're different. They're different to what we would say. They're different to the stories we make about our own landscape on the way to work. We own this landscape. We own part of that. We're comfortable in that. We farm it. We do whatever we want to it. We destroy it in many aspects. They didn't. This was new for them. They owned their land for the first time. They had a place. They were masters of land, masters of animals, masters of their own existence. And that was a magical thing. And if we look at the Marina tribe, we see how these things were made. And there's fantastic accounts of how they are steeped in ritual. It's not, let's just knock up a megalith to show our neighbours how cool we are, just for something to do. What they were doing was charting the seasons. They were charting how the stones could be sanctified, quarried, and brought to the sacred place. There were rituals of who's allowed to get involved, who is allowed to get involved, who is privileged enough to get involved in this. Now, they were small tribes. You're not getting more than 100 people making these things. They're taking a long time. But in Madagascar, with the Marina tribe, you see that there were massive rituals. So now I'm just going to read a small section of a book about the Marina tribe. And the book is Dolmens for the Dead by Roger Jousson. Okay, so what we have here is a description of how the Marina tribe built their tombs. 11 stones were needed for tombs built in the 19th century. 4 for the walls, 5 for the beds, 1 for the door, and the last as a large roofing slab. These stones were taken from quarries and brought to the building place of the tomb. Before the stones were broken up, a red cock or a sheep was sacrificed, and its blood was drained onto the slab. Once the weak point of the stone had been established, a fire was lit and moved along until the stone split. To transport the stones, a sort of sledge was made, and the slab tied onto the wooden cross pieces. This, the loading phase, was accompanied by a meal of cooked beef and rice. The stone was watched overnight by the stonemaster, and early in the morning everyone, men, women and children, gathered to haul it. With ropes of vegetable fibre it was dragged by all, under the direction of one man who rode on the slab and guided manoeuvres by a chant that was taken up by the hauliers. When at last all the stones were ready at the site cleared for building, the stonemaster slaughtered 2 or 3 fine fat cattle whose grease was smeared on the stones. The meat was distributed to all. Then began the digging of the tomb. This could only be done with the approval of the astrologer, who determined the correct day, the end of the lunar month Asarotene, and after the exorcism of a fowl of a certain colour. It fell to the youngest man to begin digging with the old, well-worn spade. Once the work had been started, the others carried on. The 11 stones were taken down into the cavity, the 4 walls, then the 5 beds, then the large roofing slab, and finally the door, always orientated to the west. Then began the transfer of the dead from their old to the new ancestral tomb, or their temporary burial in the tomb. Temporary burials were frequent in Marina for several reasons. A person who died too close in the time of the feast of Fandroana, the anniversary feast of the 3 most famous kings, could not be buried in the vault of the ancestors, nor could those who died far away and who had to wait for someone to fetch them home. The same waiting period in the temporary grave was necessary for those who had no ancestral tomb. Lastly, those who died of smallpox or infectious illnesses could not enter the ancestral tomb by an interdict, which could, however, be raised by order of the king. Okay, so that's how they were built. That's how they were built. The holy man rides the rock as it is brought to the place. But what then? What then? How are they used? What have archaeologists found? What archaeologists have found is that the small chambers in lots of these tombs are filled with bones. Okay? Well, you say, they're used for burial. People are buried there. Yeah, they are. But in a very different way to what we'd expect now. What is happening is people are being excarnated. Like in Zoroastrianism and the Parsi cultures of India and Iran, and the concept of the Tower of Silence, where they go up to platforms and the bodies are laid out once people are died, and the vultures come and they pick their bones clean. This is the kind of thing that was happening in the Neolithic. Now, we don't know exactly how. There could have been something like a Tower of Silence, like in India, where the bodies are put out and the birds pick them clean. They could have been buried and they could have waited for the bodies to decay and then come back and collected the bones. We're not quite sure of that. We have no evidence for that. That's difficult to find out. But what we do know is that the way they're piled up, this happened. They're not laid out in graves. That doesn't happen until much later in the Bronze Age. What we find, and much earlier you get that too, and you have Paleolithic burials with red ochre round the heads, and a lot of symbolism in those burials too. So the symbolism of death and burial has gone back for thousands of years already by this point. But it changes. And they're excarnating these people, they're defleshing the bones, and then they're piling them into these chambers. What do they do with them? Why? Why do they do that? Many tombs, it looks like the bones have been disturbed a few times. What are they doing? Why are they changing how they're buried and how they're piled? Well, in Madagascar, what we see is that the bones of the ancestors are indeed defleshed, and then they are wrapped in swathes of material called lambas. And the number of layers that you get tells you how important a person was. The more layers of cloth that the bones are wrapped in, the higher status they had in the society. And then every year, ritually, the bones of the ancestors are brought out, and that's what they believe. These are the bones of the ancestors of the tribe. And they're brought out and they're celebrated. And they're passed around, and people revere the ancestors. And most of us have heard of ancestor worship, and this is where it comes from. This is the idea behind that. So that's what we think. We think places like the Calderstones were used for ancestor worship. Not everyone was buried in these tombs. When you look at certain tombs from around the world, from around Europe, you see that not everyone in the tribe was buried in these places. It's not representative. You get men, you get women, you also sometimes get children. So what might that mean? Well, we don't know. I mean, we can say that maybe that meant that the most high status people of the tribe were buried in the tomb. Select people were buried there. The fact that we have children shows that really status must have been inherited, because a child cannot be a hero. Really, can he or she? Can a child be a hero? Can they create that social status for themselves? Maybe not. So maybe the status in these groups that were using the Calderstones were inherited. I'm the chief of the tribe. This is my child. And they're the people that were buried in these tombs. And they were used over hundreds of years. It wasn't a one-time thing. It wasn't, Grandfather Joe's just passed away, let's bury him in the tomb and seal it up. They're more like mausoleums, where they're family tombs in essence, or tribal tombs, or tombs that are reopened for burial, but also reopened for ritual, with the bringing out of the bones and the ancestor worship. In fact, in some tombs, we have things called seal and locken. And what this is a stone slab across the entrance of the tomb with a small circular hole. And what this is thought to be is a hole to put your hands through. and feel the bones of the ancestors, to touch and revere the bones of the ancestors. Now that sounds very exotic, and you do get that in lots of exotic places, and you do get that over on the continent. We also have this at a tiny tomb in Wales, in North Wales, just outside of Bangor, called Brynia Hen Bobble. Now that is on private land, and I'm not entirely sure that you're supposed to go and look at it, although I have many times. Probably going to be arrested now for trespassing, but it's a fantastic little tomb just across the way from Bryn Cecily D, and you'd almost miss it because it's just under a little hill with a tree on top. And this has a ceiling lock-in. This has a sacred space for worshipping the bones of the ancestors and putting your hands just inside that tomb, like sacred relics. Now, these are sacred relics from the dark prehistoric past. When people say, how can we know? How can we know what they did? How can we know why they built them? This is how we know. We look at people around the world. We look at the bones that are found in there and how they're being placed in there. We look at how they're being moved around. We look at what is being put in there as they're being buried. We find a lot of stone axes in these tombs. And Neolithic stone axes are a very magical thing. You have normal axes that are chipped away at, and they look like normal flints, just a lot larger, and they're used for chopping down trees and all manner of things, and they're attached to a haft and a stick used for chopping. We have other kinds of axes which are polished, and the theory is they take 3 days to polish. That is a lot of time for people who need to grow their food. And a lot of these come from, again, exotic sounding places in Europe, Switzerland, Graig Lwyd at Penmaenmawr in North Wales has one of these axe factories. At the top of the hill, very top of the hill, there are flint outcrops. And people went up these mountains, up Graig Lwyd at Penmaenmawr. And they took the rock, they quarried this flint out, and they spent that time and they brought it down. And they polished these axes for 3 days. Now, some of them were used, some of them weren't. In other places, we find these polished stone axes. In Ireland, there's one tomb with a circle of these polished stone axes all pointing up, placed into the ground, and they were never used. Analysis has been done for residues and things like that to see, is there anything left on them? Is there any tree resin? Is there any vegetable matter? Is there anything like that? Nothing. They were never used. A whole circle of these perfect axes quarried from these far up, dangerous places in the mountains. They're carried back. How many people must it have taken to go and do this? How much time is that off farming your land? This was important. This was an important thing. It seems like this was a sacred thing. Many of these tombs are built in Ireland in very liminal places, the in-between places. They're built where rivers meet the earth, the sea meets rock. They're built at the tops of mountains where earth meets sky, the in-between places. So archaeologists think that duality was a very important concept in the Neolithic mind. And we can ask, are these places the sacred places? Are these the places where the spirits lived, the dangerous places at the top of mountains? Is that why these axes were so important? You travel to the dangerous, sacred place of the spirits, and you bring back a piece of that rock, a piece of that mountain, and you polish it for days. And it's perfect, and it's pristine, and it's never used. And it's placed in the tombs of the dead, in the tombs of the ancestors. Is that an offering to them? Is that an offering to their spirits? Is that for them to carry into the spirit world? Is that bringing part of the spirits of those far away sacred places that can often be seen from where they lived, seen from these other tombs, these high points in the landscape? Is that bringing, in a sense, the spirit of that place to this ancestral tomb? That we don't know, that we can only speculate on. But when we look at how other tribes in more modern times are creating these stories about their beliefs, about their rituals, about their spirits, and they're telling these stories and passing them on to their children and their children after them, these are the kinds of stories that we're hearing. So when we look at the Calderstones, and it's a few stones in a greenhouse and we say, they're amazing, but how can we know? That's how we know. That's what we know. And that was happening right here. This was here. This was Liverpool. This was your social landscape. This was your walk to work. These are the stories that hit you in the face and explode in your mind on your way to Tesco's. These echoes of prehistoric man and woman and the children that they had between them. And these are the echoes of the spirits of this place.